Thank you so much for being here. And I'm not sure how full a room we have. I'll just kind of scroll through. But we've got quite a few people. So we should, in the interest of time, definitely get going. But Malcolm, your last name is no coincidence with Bryony Penn. So I don't know much about you. So if you could please give us an introduction. I know you're related to dear Bryony, but if you could take it away. I'll be busy looking at the chat as we proceed to take out any nuggets and flag them to you towards the end of the presentation, if that's appropriate. So take it away. Thank you for being here,
Malcolm. No problem. Yeah, so yeah, that's not a coincidence. Brian is my sister, my older sister. So yeah, I'm from Victoria. Lived on Salisbury Island from 1988 to 2000, and then in 2000 shifted to New Zealand. So we've been here living on the east coast of the North Island in Gisborne since then. And since 2001, I've been working for New Zealand's, what's called Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. We're now called the Ministry for Primary Industries, but I'm working for that organization since 2001. And during that entire time, I've been working in a forestry space, primarily for erosion control forestry. But since 2008, working also with New Zealand's emissions trading scheme, and which I guess is why Bryony's sort of suggested I be part of this. Just so I am quite familiar with how New Zealand's running its emissions trading scheme here and some of the background details on it. So yeah, I think that's kind of my backstory in a nutshell. I forwarded some information. I'm not sure if that was distributed or not, but yeah, it's a lot to cover. I thought it might be helpful if people had that information, because it would probably do a better job of conveying the facts than I can in this time. And I could just answer questions that people had about it. Yeah, I can just ramble on if you want about the emissions trading scheme.
I think telling that story would be really great. I think given the breadth of our audience, is really telling the story about the policy infrastructure in New Zealand with an eye to the environment you're actually very familiar with, and that's BC. And I think one of the things why we're in this room is like, what can we do? What can we copy? How can we emulate what you're doing? So to get the story about that would be really great.
Sure. Well, I guess one thing I should just add to my backstory is that my role is currently I'm a spatial analyst. So it's basically I do GIS mapping. So I'm part of a team that assesses eligibility for New Zealand's emissions trading scheme. But my role did encompass more of a public information, a public-facing angle to it, where I used to go out and deal with landowners and talk to them and encourage them to, well, inform them basically. We couldn't encourage them to sign up, but inform people about emissions trading scheme. But I guess the first thing I would say, just listening in on this morning, I am familiar with BC, obviously, and Salisbury Island in particular. But on the other hand, I haven't lived there for 20 years. And I've been home a few times, but never long enough. And I do follow the news quite a bit. But I'm not totally au fait with everything that's going on there. But one thing I say is New Zealand is a very different landscape in every sense of the word from what the situation is in New Zealand, just in terms of, well, not so much the issues, climate change and all that is just as much an issue here. We've had our warmest, hottest years these past few years. There's forest fires starting up in places where there never used to be forest fires. And it's been, dry and things. So it's happening here. But in terms of land ownership and just the starting place for New Zealand is very different. I don't know how familiar people are with New Zealand, but essentially the North Island of New Zealand is basically one large farm. They got cleared quite severely at the turn of the last century, I guess, probably and mostly by the end of the Second World War, I think. much of the North Island has been cleared of its native forests, and just the areas that are too hard to reach, like the hill country, has the remnant of native forest. There's a different story. Well, South Island is similar, just that there's more land down there that you can't farm. So there's more native forest down there. But so when in terms of protecting the forest, a lot of the native forest is gone. And so with the emissions trading scheme right now, a lot of the clientele that, well, the New Zealand's emissions trading scheme, it's basically about afforestation. So it's encouraging new forests. And a lot of it is exotic forest. So that you can divide New Zealand, when you talk about forestry in New Zealand, or forest in New Zealand, it's a divide between the remnant native forest and exotic forest, which is essentially Pinus radiata. So New Zealand's forest industry is an exotic forest industry. It's run by corporate companies, and the sort of consenting and all that's run by local governments with a framework of policy that's implemented by the central government, who I work for. And the emissions trading scheme is set up primarily to work for the exotic forest. You can put in native forestry. But I guess one other key point with the New Zealand emissions trading scheme is that it divides forests into two camps. Well, I guess not only is it exotic and indigenous forests, there's also pre-90 forests and post-89 forests. And pre-90 forest is essentially old growth forest. And within New Zealand's emissions trading scheme, pre-90 forest is excluded. So you can't actually put that into the emissions trading scheme. So it's only post-89 forest. So that's where it's either exotic stuff that's been planted, or any land that's reverting, or there are native plantings going on in a small scale. But it's primarily exotic forest that's in the emissions trading scheme right now. So that's kind of the lay of the land of the emissions trading scheme. In terms of the history, the New Zealand, it kicked in, well, they kicked it off in 2008. I think from memory, what happened was there was a Labour government in power. So that was like an NDP government. And they tried to bring in a carbon tax. And the opposition party at the time, which was largely supported by farmers. I guess that's another interesting, in terms of different landscape here. One of the primary emitters of carbon in New Zealand are farmers. It's the methane. So, and there's a lot of farming. New Zealand's economy is dependent on agriculture, and so they have a huge say in how things go. It's hard to develop any policy that doesn't address the needs of farming. So, as a fallback option to bringing in a carbon tax, New Zealand introduced the emissions trading scheme back in 2008. Right now, it's farming is actually excluded from that. So there's the forestry is like the sequestering side of it. So, and that's the part that we oversee. Even the management of that is divided between different sections of government. So I work for the forestry part of the ministry, and forestry is it's the sequestration side of the equation. But the actual emission trading scheme is run by a different ministry for business, and then the Ministry for Environment sort of do all the carbon accounting side of things, and they're keeping the ledger in place. So New Zealand signed up to Kyoto and the commitments there, and so there's a carbon accounting where they know whether we're in the red or in the black in terms of our carbon, and that's monitored by the Ministry for Environment. So yeah, our function at the Agriculture Ministry for Primary Industries is purely managing the forestry side of that and running the scheme that people could join up with their forest, and they receive credits. Do you want to know how that runs? It's such a wide encompassing I
Yeah,
don't know where.
actually, what I'd love to do, I'd love to bring some of the other, we've got an amazing talent with you, including you on the line. And in the 10 minutes we have remaining, it would be really great to hear from them, because I think, you know, what comes to mind for me as a question immediately is, I can see from my relatively uneducated point of view in these matters that the regime or regimen in New Zealand has faults. I mean, in terms of ecosystem viability, it seems to skew towards the exotics and not towards any kind of sort of regeneration of indigenous forests. So do you have any comments on that? What would you do if you were, you know, king of the world in terms of changing the policies that you have there? What would you keep and what would you throw away, I guess is my question.
Well, I guess what I could just say is all native forest in New Zealand is, well, it's either under the management of Department of Conservation, the Crown Forest. Native forest on private land is heavily regulated. You can't harvest any tree. You can't clear cut any native forest in New Zealand without consent or a permit. And that was part of my role as well. Is I work with the people who oversee the management of native forests. So, and that does incorporate, you know, ecosystems and all of that. So you can't, like I said, you can't clear cut native forest in New Zealand. You're only at any time you can only take 20% of any tree crop that's there, and it is heavily managed. So that part of the equation is looked after. It's not addressed in the emissions trading scheme. It's purely a carbon trading thing, and it's incentivized by making the most money. And Primus radiata is, if you're in, people join the emissions trading scheme, you're not less for conservation and more for making money. It's just added this whole new income stream for corporate forest companies.
Right.
So and it had a huge impact on the management of forestry. Like New Zealand, it was a short, like Primus radiata has like a 30-year rotation, and that's how forestry companies operated. Now they've got this income stream where, you know, they could actually leave the trees for longer. So it's changed the whole dynamics of how they manage forests. In terms of incentivizing native, I mean, there is incentive for looking at indigenous forests and incentivizing it within the ETS. And the government's actually developing policy right now to look at getting more native forests established. But it is, like I say, everything all old growth forest in New Zealand is outside of the emissions trading scheme. So we're only looking at newly planted. So that's what they're looking to use this scheme, the emissions trading scheme, to incentivize, well, how they can use it to incentivize native planting. Because right now it's less incentivized. Like I said, if you're in it to make money, which most people are, emissions trading scheme, exotic trees are the way to go. The regrowth rates of native are you know, half that. So you look at the growth curves, and it's just not there.
What's the appetite federally to considering having the regime apply to native forests and native planting?
Well, it's not. Yeah, I'd say in terms of general public, the general public pretty unaware of the whole emissions trading scheme. It's, you know, it's pretty much landowners and forest companies who are involved with it, and it's large landowners. So we're talking like farmers. A lot of it's trying to encourage people, farms that were cleared of forest, you know, after the 40s. They paid people to clear a forest here for farmland. And now we're paying them. I work for a scheme for reforestation for erosion control, and I've dealt with people who were paid, you know, 40, 50 years ago to clear land, and now we're paying them to put the trees back on the land. The other thing I just of interest is dealing with indigenous people there, like Maori landowners. Large part of they factor significantly in our dealings, largely because the land that they have ownership of a lot of it is marginal land. It's land that is less productive in many cases, at least where I'm from, on the East Coast of Gizzy here, Gisborne. I mean, majority of landowners here would be Maori landowners. And the way the land ownership structured, their land blocks have multiple owners. So it's I won't start to explain how it all works, but the landowner have multiple owners, and in some cases they've incorporated to form a trust to oversee the management of their land. And in those cases, the ownership is efficient, and things sort of happen. A lot of these blocks, there's no incorporation. You're dealing with several hundred owners of a few hundred hectares of land, and it's really hard. The decision-making process doesn't happen quickly there. So those people are sort of missing out on making use of the ETS. Where there's good ownership structure and management, they're able to join into the scheme. The scheme, I guess, like say, the upshot is a lot of Maori land ownership has mature native forest on it. Like they say, it's been excluded from the scheme, so they've missed out on that thing. But where there is reverting land, so land that was cleared for farming, but because it was so marginal, like steep hill country, it's reverting back to native forest. And those lands are actually eligible for emissions trading scheme. And it's quite basically they just have to leave the land alone. It's eligible, and if they leave the land alone, they can lock it up for carbon and just get money off it. The problem is, depending on the returns for farming, they make more money farming it than they do off their carbon. So there's that kind of decision-making process. But I mean,
it reminds me of the problem we have here, where a lot of the projects we could be doing are stymied by the lack of a proper price signal for the bad actions. So it sounds like that's the case there too, where there's an insignificant price on carbon.
Yeah, well, it's doing well I mean, a lot of it is, it just doesn't happen fast enough. The carbon, in a lot of cases, they're paying rates on the land or whatever. They have expenses in terms of ownership of land, and the carbon doesn't meet that right away, whereas farming does. And a lot of people, there's employment, it's kind of alienation from the land. Like I know that's one big issue, is having sorted, gone through treaty settlements and all sorts of stuff, and got land ownership settled, to then lock it up in a forest for perpetuity is kind of, for some of the owners, it's viewed as alienation again. So there's all sorts of dynamics there. So it's not hard, but it is a hard thing to navigate. But it is.
Sorry. Coming back to the exotic issue, I mean, is there any biological value to these exotic plantations? Just speaking from a North American context, those would probably be biological deserts.
Well, people say that too about Pinus radiata. It's a monoculture. They're all the same, genetic diversity. They're probably not that far apart from each other. And they're all even age stands and stuff. So it's basically like from one angle, they look like just a field of corn or something growing there. I mean, they're all planted in straight lines, and they all get harvested at the same time. But my experience, because I've been in just about every forest on the East Coast here, and I have a little small forestry block of radiata myself. There's more native forests, more native regen happening underneath those forests, under exotic forests, than anywhere else. Like if you want to get, in certain areas, if you want to get a native forest back as quickly as possible, probably planting radiata forests is the fastest way to get that happening, because the native sort of primary colonizer released around here is a smaller tree called it's a tea tree. It's called manuka or kanuka, and it's quite slow growing.
We're about to all scatter.
And
We're about to all scatter into back into the plenary. So I just wanted to ask.
oh, okay.
I just wanted to ask before you go: is it fair to say that the New Zealand model is a cautionary tale for us here?
I think there's elements of it. I guess talking with Brian, I mean, one of the key elements is we're central government. We're actively helping landowners to get in. Like I say, my role is we review people's applications. And we identify what's eligible, what isn't, using GIS. Like we have state-of-the-art GIS, and we've got a database of all the aerial imagery of the country. So, and we have people out there who are promoting it. So the central government is the driver for the emissions trading scheme, and we're key to recruiting people into it. But I guess you can't sort of go and recruit people into it. I mean, you got to appeal to their. We just have to say what it is. You can't sort of say this is the best thing since sliced bread. You just put the facts in front of people.